That was the secret that I was missing. That was the secret sauce. You know how they use Worcestershire sauce, whatever the heck that stupid sauce is, and like your burger sauce?
What sauce?
Worcester sauce?
Worcestershire.
Compression is your Worcestershire, whatever the heck the stupid sauce is in your drums. That's how you get good drum sound.
You're listening to the GWNL-Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Welcome to episode 3 of With Audio Pros, Studio Bros, and Nobody Speaks in Prose. This week is compression and dynamics. It's a professor stuff, as Avicii used to say. Anyways, we're covering dynamics this week. It's episode 3. We've covered equalization last week, and the prior week was basics of mixing. And our first topic is, what is dynamics or dynamic compression or dynamic processing? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Do you want me to take a stab at it? Let's see.
Well, first things first, if we talk about like just compression is a type of dynamic processing where generally you try to reduce the dynamic range of your signal.
Or mess with the dynamic range. Yeah, compressor reduces it. So yeah, dynamics processors are anything that messes with the amplitude of a signal. So any processor that processes the dynamics, the amplitude.
The minimum and the maximum volume or amplitude of said sound waves. It's really neat.
Yeah, really neat.
So types of signal, types of dynamic processors would be like expander, gate, compression, limiter.
And then there's variations on that, like the dynamic EQ and multiband compressor, but it's true those four are the main
transient designers, et cetera, et cetera.
He designs a transient so that the kick drum is perfect.
So there's those four. There's two categories. So an expander and a gate. It's all about the threshold, saying when the signal the amplitude goes below that threshold, we're going to either turn the signal down or turn it off. So an expander turns it down, so it expands the dynamic range, and a gate turns it all the way off, so it closes the gate on it. And so they also call it a noise gate, right? Because it turns off when the signal goes below the level, that gets turned off. And that's what in live sound, use gates all the time to help avoid feedback. Get mics to turn off when you're not using them. And then the other two are the compressor and the limiter, and they're kind of the opposite. When the signal goes over the threshold, it starts to turn the signal down. And a compressor will just turn it down a little bit, let it still go over the threshold some, whereas a limiter is a compressor on steroids. And so as soon as the signal gets to the threshold, it just kind of gets turned down enough so it just stops. So is that
compression is great. I like it.
Compression is the most commonly used one of all of them. So
I would also submit that compression is also one of the hardest to learn to hear, and to like other things like EQ. It's a more drastic change. It's something that's more noticeable or more like present in that manner. Compression, when used appropriately, can be a drastic and in a lot of ways bad manner of dealing with situations, but it's not as easy to hear until you overdo it. I feel like a lot of the time.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's easy to hear a gate or hear what a gate's doing, but as far as like hearing what a compressor is doing, it's a little bit more difficult to understand.
Yeah, I've recently had like a whole like eye-opening, like I've seen God experience with compressors, and it's like changed the way that I've mixed. Yeah, my come to Jesus moment about compression. I was having some issues on a mix that I was working on, and I had changed up the way that I was doing my work, and I found ways that I could use the compressor to bring out, like, sorry, this is before we're getting, this is like, we haven't even gotten to history of compression, but I was able to like bring out stuff that like I wasn't able to bring out before. I will also, I think there are side effects that we should probably discuss about what happens when you compress the signal. Like the simplicity of it is when you stop the top of the loudness thing, if you make the loudest thing not as loud as it is, it saturates the sound of the thing. This is how you get some things, like that's kind of how a saturator works. Some saturators, it depends, but like you're now shrinking the total dynamic thing, and this is where you get things like, oh, it beefs up the sound or it thickens it up. That's how a lot of people, like, that's how you get a really poppy, at least for me, I've learned from compression. That's how you get a good drum sound. That's how you get good toms. That's how you get good snare and kick. Yeah. Like good compression.
Compression is the sound of popular music.
Yes.
I think that's important to say.
Yeah.
So
the loudness wars, the only thing that we lost in the loudness wars was dynamics.
That was the casualty.
Yeah, the casualty was dynamics.
So is that really a bad thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think in certain contexts, yes.
And that's true. That's another topic that we want to talk about later on, the loudness wars too. And I think the other fundamental concept here is that it sounds backwards to think that when you turn down the signal with what a compressor is doing, that you're actually going to make it sound louder. But by turning down the peaks, and like you said, like Joe said, you decrease the dynamic range. Now you can just turn that whole thing up, and now your average volume is higher, your average amplitude, and our ears hear in averages, so it sounds louder to us, even though the peak level is not any higher.
Down.
Psychoacoustics, beautiful thing.
ASMR psychoacoustics.
Is that really a part of psychoacoustics?
Yeah, like the way
you perceive it as louder. It's like when you pan something to the side, it's easier for your brain to process that sound, and it sounds louder than it is because it's in a different like spectrum, left to right. That's a psychoacoustic thing that you use. That's why panning kind of like helps with stereo separation. That's why stereo separation exists, but that's a whole nother topic. Compression, those same things, psychoacoustics.
But yeah, just understanding how we always look at things with peak meters, and our brains don't hear that way. Our ears hear in averages, which is more like VU meters. So it's taking 3 seconds of information and averaging it together. And so if it's all 3 seconds are like really, really loud, then it's going to sound really, really loud. But
so like
the 3 seconds go loud and then soft and loud and soft, we're going to hear it as like medium loud sort of thing.
Huh.
So it's just like, it's important to understand how our brains and our ears, receive that sound information. But that's what compression is, this magical thing, because our ears hear sound on averages. So
and compression is used like in live sound. Like I've definitely used it to like put people in boxes. Like guitarist doesn't want to turn down. Okay, well you get an infinity ratio and have fun with that brick wall, sucker.
Which
like
then becomes a limiter. Yeah, which then becomes a limiter. Yeah.
It's because they have forced my hand. They didn't want to listen to me. They didn't want to balance out their gain. So now I will balance out their gain for them. Punk.
Yes.
No,
the true power of an audio engineer is the use of the compressor.
Don't play that game with me. but realistically, all that happens in that instance is they ruin the articism that could be there. When you have to, in a live sound situation, when you have to use compression in a way to like mitigate problems, it prevents you from actually mixing better. And that's the thing that you have to kind of like balance out. Like, how aggressive am I with that? Like, I don't want to ruin the musicality of the situation, but I have to manage this because people who do not balance their gain on a stage can pop speakers. They can blow things up. They can cause problems. People unplugging things at the wrong time. Compressors help to alleviate that in a live sound situation, and they can like minimize and mitigate a lot of problems that way.
Well, I think it comes down to like, you got to solve your problems first, and then after that you can do artistic things. At least that's kind of like my mentality with mixing in general, whether it's live sound or in the studio.
Yeah.
And it's the same when you're using a compressor. Generally, you're trying to solve some issues first before you do any sort of artistic thing.
Right. And I agree with that. Like, that's kind of how I work, because it's the nature of how you have to work in that instance. But with live sound, you have a time component, and sometimes you don't have the time because they have created such a long laundry list of problems that
you
you're
don't
just
have the
trying
time to do that artistic.
Yeah, you're you're going to get a mix, and it's
it is what it is.
Solving problems, yeah.
So I kind of skipped around a little bit. Ben, do you want to hit us with the history of audio compression and dynamic compression, or if Bryant wants to take this one?
Basically, what I know of the history of compression, at least what I think that I know. I don't know if this is correct, so you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, it was created for a radio. It was originally created for like broadcast, because if they would reach a certain level, it would like basically do something.
It bleeds into the other bands.
Oh, okay.
If you're at 94,
what is it? AM, right? It was dealing with like
AM frequencies.
Yeah, but if you're like at AM like 87 or something, like 87.5, right. If you get too loud, it'll bleed into 87.6 and 87.4.
So can I take a moment to explain that? Because like AM radio versus FM radio. So I read this on Reddit, and it is the best description of like how FM versus AM works. He's like, you are in one neighborhood and your friend's in the next neighborhood over, and you realize that you can send like a Morse code message by changing how loud you yell into the next neighborhood. So you go like that. And then you do like that as a Morse code. So like, and you're still yelling, right? But you're changing how loud you're yelling in a specific pattern to create Morse code, right? And so your friend does really good, but the problem is he kind of loses you when you're not yelling super loud, and he doesn't know. He thinks that you're still yelling or whatever. So it creates problems with translating it over. So you realize that if you yell at a constant loud volume and you go and you're changing the pitch, it's a lot easier to understand and like understand the Morse code signal that's being sent. FM is frequency modulation, AM is amplitude modulation, i.e. amplitude modulation is changing how loud and quiet you are. So compressors used in this instance help to like create consistent signals that can be transmitted over long distances, because now instead of having amplitudes or volume levels that are changing so drastically to jump into other bands, it's minimizing that, mitigating it, which still maintains the integrity of the signal. So you can still understand what's being said, but you're not going to bleed into other frequencies, which is like the whole point with AM. FM, it's not so much an issue because you're dealing with a different pitch and you have certain other leniences with that.
But you still have, like, if the amplitude gets too great in FM, it will bleed into the other bands. And there's, there's FCC, like fines. It's like every time it bleeds into, if it peaks over it, it's like $3,000 every time it peaks. So,
wow. Yeah, right. They have like somebody just sitting there like,
like you had 32 peaks, so that's $96,000.
Yeah, right. Gosh. Well, but you can get special permits to. I know this because I had some friends that did. You can get special permits to actually use high powered antennas. The issue that you have is you're stepping into other frequencies like emergency broadcast frequencies, and that's why the fines are so hefty. That's why a lot of that stuff is so crazy, is you're stepping into like potentially emergency broadcast frequencies, TV channels, news channels. That's another big one. And so you can actually get like licenses to do that, but you then have to clear it with like the FCC for that specific location, for that specific event and that venue. And like, it's doable. And okay,
maybe not.
So like, as Bryant was saying, it's true. The first development of compressors or dynamics processors was for radio. So,
okay. And then maybe we should talk about the different types of compressors that there are. So like, I believe that first one that was created was a tube based compressor. Later they developed solid state or FET compressors. Mm-hmm. And then you have VCA compressors.
Yeah, there's a handful of ones that. So there's optical compressors, which is
LA2A.
Yeah, which is the most interesting thing to discuss how it works. It's super cool because basically the signal that's coming in feeds a light, and every time the amplitude changes of the signal, the light gets brighter or dimmer. And then they have an optical cell that senses the light's brightness, and so the optical cell is what is the turning down mechanism. So as the light gets brighter, it triggers that optical cell, which then turns the signal down.
So that's essentially what uses the like attack. What controls the attack?
Yeah, is the is the relationship between the optical light that's going off and the optical cell that's receiving it, and how quickly that happens, you know. And then there's the VCA, you know, deals with a voltage control amplifier.
I like VCA.
Whereas like the tube is just like a regular amplifier, and it's all just about how it's detecting when you go over the threshold, and then putting some attenuation on it whenever it goes. Like another way it's been described to me as an automatic turn downer. And so it's like if you think of just somebody with a super fast reflexes on a fader, just turning it down every time it gets too loud. That's what it's. And so all the technology was like, how can we take analog circuitry and have it automatically turn down stuff really quick? And so they came up with a handful of ideas, you know.
Yeah.
And none of them work perfectly, which they all have different characteristics because of that.
Yeah.
So then let me ask this question. I think that's a great tie-in to something else. What are some of the most common... So like we've talked about optical, we've talked about VCA, we've talked about other like solid state compression. There's the 1176, which is a common compressor, and there are 76 style compressors. You're going to find plugins that are designed after the 1176 by DBX. You're going to find LA2As, LA3As. So I think these are important to cover and to bring up. Like the LA2A is an optical style compressor, right?
Should we take it back a step, because we haven't explained the different parameters to control on a compressor.
Oh yeah, let's finish that up, and then let's talk about the different compressors. Like just bring up the names, you know.
Yeah. So as far as like things to control on a compressor, generally you'll have 4 basic controls. You'll have a threshold, which is when the point at which the compressor
will be triggered.
Then you have the attack, which is how fast the compressor will work. You have the release, which is how fast or slow after the compressor is the signals below the threshold that it'll stop working. And then what's the 4th thing that I'm thinking of?
Makeup gain or ratio.
Ratio. That's what I was thinking of. Ratio.
Very important.
Then you have the ratio, how aggressive your compressor will work. So if you have like a 4-to-1 ratio, for every 4 decibels above the threshold, only 1 decibel will be allowed above that threshold.
Blah, blah, louder, blah, blah, less louder.
Exactly.
I'm horrible at the math, and they can both attest to this, because there were so many times in like classes where I'd be like, wait, they're like, all right, so if it comes in at like 21 dB and it's a 4-to-1 and the thresholds, I'm like, huh? I'm still bad at it. I still can't do the math.
Blah, blah.
Blah, blah, math, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Louder, not as loud on the out, okay?
Yeah, the math doesn't matter as much. Anyway.
I mean, it does. But.
Yeah, the higher ratio, the more aggressive. The lower ratio, the ratio.
The less
and there's some plugins that really show it well. Like the 1-to-1 ratio, if you think about it, it just means that it's one. The ratio is between the input and the output. And so if the input is 1, then the output's going to be 1.
If you're familiar with like building models, a 1-to-1 scale model is going to be exactly the same size, and the bigger the number, the smaller the thing. It's inverse. They call inverse relationships. Audio inverse relationships.
Woo.
Yeah. So I mean, if it's the input's 4 dB over the threshold, the output's going to be 1 dB over the threshold. And 10-to-1 is where you start to get into limiting. So 10-to-1 is really called soft limiting, and then you got 100-to-1 and infinity-to-1.
And the reason it's infinity to 1 is because everything is a logarithm. Welcome to audio.
And that's, we hear in logarithmic. Yeah. So, but so those are the main controls, and they apply to all of the dynamics processors, not just
Now, there are some dynamics processors that have more simplified parameters on them. There are some that only give you an input and an output adjustment. And they have like set knobs for each ratio. Like you can't, there are some that it's a dial and you can choose like a specific thing, but there are others where it's like 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1. Anyways, go on.
Yeah.
Brian.
So if you like in that case, if you look at the example of like an 1176 compressor, there's not a threshold on it. It has a fixed threshold. And the way to change the amount of compression is by adjusting your input and your output knobs.
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
And then you've got the LA2A, which the relationship between the light and the optical cell is really what defines that the the attack and release and the ratio, all of that. So all you have in there is an input gain and a peak reduction knob. So it's like really dynamic to the controls of the compressor, and then it reacts differently to the content that's coming into it. And then of course you have digital compressors and Dynamics processors that we've created with ones and zeros that can control all of these features. And you're just saying, yeah, when it gets to this point, I'm going to turn it down, and I want it to act this fast and release this, attack.
They're
this
very
fast and release this
scientific.
slow.
They're surgical even.
Yeah.
Now I do want to say this. There are some digital compressors that are digital in the sense that, so some compressors, like the old analog ones, when the threshold would trigger the compression, it wouldn't happen instantly. It would close and it would create a different type of sound than a digital compressor, which is just, imagine a mountain and just chop off the peak of that mountain. That's how a lot of digital compression is perceived to work. These days, with modern algorithms and modern design, a lot of those compressors do function a lot more like the analog counterparts that they were designed after. So to some extent, there's a hot argument out there whether analog gear is super important or not. Yes and no. And this is kind of where I don't want to get into that. That's a whole nother argument. But just realize that a lot of the modern digital plugins are very good and very good at imitating the old analog plugins. And you can save yourself a lot of money by not buying like analog gear, like some crazy gearheads who own like, $1 million sounds, studio. They're like, oh, unless you have the classic 1176 written by DBX, you're not getting the actual 76 sound. There are people who do that.
It's not DBX.
It's not DBX.
The 160.
I don't even care. The 160, whatever.
DBX.
I don't even like compressors anyway. Why do we even have this episode? I hate compression.
I don't use compression. I just automate the volume fader throughout every single track.
Yeah, I just have a really fast finger that turns it.
I just have all my fingers on all 32 tracks when I'm mixing live. I don't actually use compression.
I just put Waves Vocal Rider on every single track.
That's basically.
You guys should have stopped me earlier. Now we're gonna have to input in like who did the 1176 then? Smart guy.
Not
real easy.
Not Universal Audio.
Well, Universal Audio does the reissue
of it,
but the original
was it Teletronics? No, Teletronics is the
LA2A.
LA2A,
and I can't remember. I'll find it.
Is it your?
Yeah, you bet.
Yuri. It's Yuri.
Yuri.
UREI. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't know how to say that.
76s are really nice on drums, by the way.
Yeah. I like
so.
yeah.
Depending on the kind of compressor or depending on the use that you want to use, maybe a reason to use a particular compressor over another. For example, on drums, because an 1176 is a FET compressor, it may be better to use that on drums because the drum transient is such a quick attack that to catch that, an 1176 or a DBX 160 is really good for those things. Whereas an LA2A, you may not want to use on a snare.
It's a little slow.
It's great on a vocal or an acoustic guitar or something, or lead or something. LA2As are awesome on lead vocal, Well, let's not get too, I think it's important not to get too complex.
Man. Yeah.
Because this is the problem is everybody's like, oh, well, I need an LA2A on a lead vocal because it's supposed to sound good on it. I think that getting the basic concept, what are we using compression for in our mix? That's the broader concept.
Okay, can I take a stab at this one?
Yeah. As long as you don't talk about radio.
No, I don't like I don't even like radio. I don't listen to the radio. Anyways, so a lot of times I have people that are moving across my stage and dancing and singing, and their mic technique is horrible, and I have to deal with that changing dynamic contrast. I use a compressor to fix that. That's a philosophy of use that I use for compressors. It helps mitigate overly dynamic parts. And that's a way that you can use it to fix problems.
Okay.
I think another use for compression is to either make something more aggressive, you kind of emphasize the attack and the onset, or to do the opposite with it, try to de-emphasize the attack.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, in like rock and metal music, sometimes you'll use a little bit more aggressive compression on vocals to try and bring out the consonants, to make it feel and sound more aggressive and bring more energy to it. And it helps actually bring it out in the mix.
Psychoacoustic.
Yeah, it's true. It can be used to change the character of the sound, because like we talked about last week, you have the harmonic structure of a sound that gives it a timbre or character. But there's also what's called an envelope in and as you look in synthesizers, it's ADSR is the envelope, and that's the envelope of the sound. The attack, decay, sustain, release. And the compressor can be used to actually manipulate that, which is what you're saying, Brian, right?
Yeah.
The drums, because obviously a snare drum has a very quick attack and then a quick decay, and then it sustains a little bit and releases. And if you put a compressor on there, you could totally change how that responds and change the character of the drum.
Really get that fat snare sound.
Yeah, boy. That was the secret that I was missing. That was the secret sauce. You know how they use Worcestershire sauce, whatever the heck that stupid sauce is, in like your burger sauce?
What sauce?
Worcester sauce?
Worcestershire.
Compression is your Worcestershire, whatever the heck the stupid sauce is in your drums. That's how you get good drum sound. Anyways, so like whatever. Yeah, you can't even say it either. Okay.
I'm messing it up on purpose. I could say it right if I wanted to.
I have no idea how to say it. Even if you said it right, I couldn't say it right.
I don't think this show has the time for that. Anyways, we're not doing this. So like we have tone shaping, which is a part of compression. We have dynamic control.
Ooh, together on that. Right.
And then, gosh, there's like a third main usage, like general usage, right?
Well, there's the tone shaping goes a little further beyond just changing the envelope. That's one part of it. The other part is actually changing like the EQ response of it.
Right.
So, and that's a little bit more advanced of a
we won't go into that.
Linear phase.
Yeah.
Not applicable.
But
psychoacoustics.
I think that's the other thing that's kind of in between both of those is just that sound of popular music is that compressed sound. Yeah. And so that is, if you took a project and you're like, I'm going to make a pop song, but I'm not going to use any compression, it is not going to sound like a pop song. And there's just no way. It's like there's a specific sound that compression brings.
And it's not bad. Like there's a reason it's popular. There's a reason it is enjoyable. Now, the reason it gets a lot of flack over compression and compression gets a lot of flack is because there's a lot of people who may not use it effectively enough, or they might overdo it. And it's really easy to overdo it in ways that are kind of pedestrian.
You should only like, I think one of the popular things that I saw on the internet was you should only have your gain reduction be like 1 to 2 dB. You shouldn't do any more than 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction when you're using a compressor. And that's just absurd in my mind. Like you should use a compressor however you feel like you want to use a compressor, as long as it sounds good.
Yeah, and that's all those guidelines. We get that with EQ. We talked about it last with the EQ. One. It's like, oh well, I can't add too much or take away too much. No, you got to add or take away to what sounds good. And same thing with compression. If you have to compress, the bejesus out of the.
If you want to have 20 dB of gain reduction and it's sounding like that's what you need, then that's exactly what you need is 20 dB of gain reduction.
Exactly.
And you'll get that as you play around with it more and play with compressors. Like the best way you're going to learn how to use any of these like tools is to use them and to make the mistakes. Like there's not really an easier way to understand compression than just diving in and accepting that you're probably going to overcompress a lot before you start to like figure out what the right space is and all those other things. And listening to reference tracks and hearing how they do things in relation to what you're doing. Like if you're doing a metal track, find someone who's doing something similar and listen, compare yours to them and listen to how they're using those things. References are great for that.
I honestly think that one of the best ways to develop your ear to hear compression is to overcompress. Take a signal that you like, you record something and then compress the hell out of it, like limit it, listen to it, listen to it without the compression, and then listen to it with the compression and see like how that affects the sound. That will really help you develop your ear on compression.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same idea as like with EQ. We talked about like crank it up and hear the problem and then pull it back down. It's the same thing. You have to just get a little extreme because it's all about subtleties. And you'll find, well, as we discussed, it's like EQ. Oh, it's about being subtle. Compression, it's about being subtle. Reverb,
you can always be aggressive with it, but then it becomes you're showing your hand, if you will, and it's like it's a game of poker, you know. Like,
it depends on like the genre too. Everything's like genre specific.
Yeah,
like in jazz, you're probably not going to use really heavy compression.
Right, subtle compression. Yeah,
you'll want to use that. Yeah,
in like rock, metal, and punk, you are gonna do some aggressive compression, some aggressive EQ with your vocals, with basically all of your tracks.
Yeah.
If you're in EDM, say goodbye to dynamics. They don't exist. and the only dynamics that exist in EDM is sidechain, and this is going to burn the sidechain compressor. They're going to sidechain that compressor on everything else. They're going to put everything else in the EDM track onto a bus, and then they're going to take a compressor and put it on that bus, and then they're going to sidechain it to the kick, and then say goodbye to everything. It's not that bad.
So
sometimes it's
like
bad.
this, but the sidechain is the only.
And I mean, if you look at some EDM mixes, it's like even like popular ones. Anyways,
except for that, and then the breakdown.
Right. And then you see okay. But like there's a lot of different things. Yes, it is genre specific. Yeah, there's a lot of different things with that when it comes to compression. And compression gets a lot of the attention rather than limiters, expanders, and gates. Expanders can be useful in circumstances where you might have, so like here's a good example. We're going to say you're reading a book and you're recording somebody who's reading a book for like an audio, you know, for like I'm trying to remember the
audiobook.
Like an audiobook, yeah, whatever. And so you're recording them. An expander can help where you can set it so that you can minimize the volume of breaths so that you can still hear the breath so it sounds natural, but it's not so over the top. And that's what an expander is used for. And it's very used for things like spoken word and things like that, or talking heads. Limiters are great. Like in live, I use limiters to prevent people from breaking my system and blowing out their own eardrums when they're running in-ears. That's an important thing. I also use gates. This is another thing. I think gates and compressors are about like compressor, gate, and maybe even both. Gates can be used to shape the sound because how quickly the gate opens,
it's messing
and how
with
fast it closes.
That envelope, right? You know,
it's the messing with like the release.
Yeah.
Well, also
and the attack. Too. Yeah.
Well, and like I use it to shape. Like if I have a ringy snare, I can either EQ it out or I can run a gate on it. Those are my two options for getting rid of the ring in a snare because I can use that gate to kind of close off the end so I don't hear so much of that ring. So like those are like the different dynamics processors and some general philosophies. We got about 5 minutes left. Do you guys want to hit any more topics on these things? There's a lot to cover.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. I mean, I would just want to second what Brian said about overcompressing. And I've said this, you know, teaching classes. I'm like, you're going to go through an overcompression stage is what I tell everybody. So get started now, overcompress like crazy so you can hear what it is. And it's like, you just have to do that. And I can pull up my old mixes from my overcompression stage and they're nastily overcompressed, but then I can hear it, you know, and that's what Joe was saying. He had his come to Jesus where he's like, I can hear the compression. I really understand it. The other thing I want to add into, which is a kind of a more advanced concept, just to kind of trigger thoughts, is that limiting is really what you use to control dynamic range. You know, when things are too loud or too soft, compression is all about tone shaping. So making things more punchy, messing with the EQ a little bit, like we talked, a more advanced feature, changing the envelope of the sound. Compression is all about that stuff and not as much about controlling dynamics. Limiters more about controlling dynamics. And that's one of those advanced concepts that, like some of the interviews with the seasoned pros have said exactly that. And there's of course crossover. There's some compressors, like there is the R compressor by Waves that I really like to use as a dynamics controlling, because it really functions more like a very transparent limiter than a real like tone shaping compressor. And so it's like a really subtle limiter is really what it is. So I love it for that, and I use it all the time for that purpose. But it's mainly to control dynamics. So,
Bryant, you have any other things to say?
No, I think we've touched on all the basics of compression and gone in deeper on some things. I don't think we need to go into sidechain or parallel compression.
Yeah,
those are fun though.
There are those things. There's de-essing too, which is a form of sidechaining, which I realized as we were talking. I'm like, that's something we should mention as a dynamics processor. Is de-essing. Like
a de-essing and a multi-band compression.
Yeah. But all of those kind of come back to those four, to the compressor, limiter.
You're kind of combining compression with another tool in those instances. A lot of the time, like a multi-band is really like an EQ and a compressor like had a child and they threw that child out on the street and said fend for yourself. No, I'm kidding. Anyways, there are so many, and like I feel like when you cover EQ and compression, you have such a deep sea of things. And I'm going to tell this, if I were to give one tip to any new mix engineers or anything, just dive in. Don't be afraid to let your mixes sound horrible. Like get it out of the way. Cause I did that. I've done that many times in my life where I just I was afraid to use something cause I didn't fully understand it. Like compression. That's a good example. That's my come to Jesus thing. Like I was afraid to use compression because I didn't want to overcompress because I knew it was bad because people told me it was bad, but I didn't understand. Like I didn't hear it. I couldn't comprehend it because I couldn't hear it. And until I overcompressed, until I just dove in and I said, you know what? I don't care. If it sounds bad, so what? I want to understand this. It wasn't until I dived in that I really started. And I'm still kind of probably in that phase where I'm like overcompressing things. Like, but I just kind of accept it, and now I understand more so the benefits that it has.
So I know that I'm still in the phase of overcompressing. Sometimes I personally get caught up in the like more advanced things. Like I was doing a mix last week, and I was trying to like accomplish some things by doing more advanced things, and then I was like, oh, I'm just gonna use one. It's not sounding good. I'm gonna redo this mix, use one EQ and one compressor, and just doing that like made my mix way better. And I didn't overcompress with those compressors before I was.
The big takeaway for me is that there's no shortcuts. And this is a big concept that gets sold and discussed online all the time, that, this is the shortcut to mixing and stuff. And that, especially with compression, there's no shortcuts where we can say, here, you've got, put your settings to this and this. Like for a kick drum, you've got to put this attack and this release and this ratio. You just can't do it because it's like everything else we've talked about. The goal is to get it to sound like you need it to sound or want it to sound. And the tool is going to get you there. And so then my phone dings. But yeah, that's what with compression, you've got to go through the work to learn how to hear it and to learn how to use it. And it just takes time and experience. And so like everybody's been saying, go through this overcompression phase, like just do it, dive in, and you get it.
Yeah. Just don't be afraid. Keep it simple. Dive in. Don't be afraid. Get your bad mixes out of the way so you can get to the good mixes. And just mix good.
Just mix good.
Just make it sound good. Like it doesn't, all that other stuff that they say about techniques and all that, it doesn't matter. Mix good. That's it. If it sounds good, it's good.
That's like your other mantra, Joe. Don't suck. Right.
Yeah. Look, it's simple because it's like, it can make sense. No, you guys mock me for this all the time. And we're going to go into this because you brought it up. Because at the end of the day, there are some things that are objectively true. Okay, whatever. But realistically, music is subjective. And a lot of the things that like Brian and you were talking about are dependent on the genre and the style and all of these other things. So yeah, mix good is the answer, because you can come, like, people can tell you all kinds of settings and other stuff, but at the end of the day, if it makes sense, and think about this, there are genres of music that have not come into existence yet.
Yeah.
What are they going to do when they mix those things? What are you going to use? You're going to use the stuff that you've heard and the things that you've done to make sense of how to mix in the future when you're dealing with a new genre that's come out. Like, the mix and the work that you put into that mix is going to change. So yeah, mix good. Don't suck. Just do music. Like, don't stress yourself about like these other things, because like I do that, and it prevents me from becoming better. And that's why it's my mantra, like, mix good, don't suck, keep it simple, because it's something that's easy to follow. And
Yeah.
I'm Joe.
I'm Bryant.
And I'm
Oh, way to mess it up.
And I messed it up.
Thank you for tuning in.